You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 16th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, we'll check in on the latest coming out of Israel as the IDF continues to strike both Syria and Gaza, killing a journalist, and reveals plans to expand settlements in the Golan Heights. In Germany, Olaf Scholz faces a confidence vote today, which he'll likely lose. We'll look at what that would mean for the country and the wider world. South Korea's parliament has voted to impeach the president, but now the Constitutional Court needs to rule on the matter. That hasn't stopped citizens from celebrating. We'll be in Seoul for the latest. Then,
protesters take on the president in Serbia as outrage still simmers over last month's railway station disaster. Find out more with me, Guy Delaunay.
Plus, we'll have a roundup of business stories and a rustle through the front pages. And finally,
obviously ended up finding parallels to our own reality, my own existence, as well as just generally the society and structure that we live in.
Austrian pop star Sofie Royer talks about her critically acclaimed new album. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Several hundred people and possibly even thousands may have been killed when the most powerful cyclone in nearly a century hit the French Indian Ocean island archipelago of Mayotte. A Russian oil tanker carrying thousands of tons of oil products split apart during a heavy storm on Sunday, spilling oil into the Kerch Strait off the coast of Crimea. And the broadcaster ABC News has agreed to pay $15 million to US President-elect Donald Trump over a defamation lawsuit after its star anchor falsely said he'd been found liable for rape instead of the legally correct but equally egregious sexual abuse. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, explosions could be heard in Damascus over the weekend and across dozens of other sites in Syria as Israel carried out airstrikes overnight in what it calls strategic areas. The attack comes despite Syria rebel leaders stating that the HTS group was not interested in conflict with Tel Aviv. The strikes happened shortly after Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he'd approved a plan to expand settlement building in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Well, I'm joined now by the foreign correspondent Hannah McCarthy. Hannah, many thanks for coming on the show. What is the latest on these Israeli strikes on Syria?
Sure. So since the rebels took control of Syria, large swathes of Syria last week, Syria has been struck more than 450 times by Israeli forces. Syria was already being struck kind of earlier in the year, but those kind of targets were focused on Hezbollah weapons depots, on Iranian kind of controlled sites or associated sites. What we're seeing in the last week is a much more focused targeting of Syrian's navy and dozens of air bases. So this is the actual kind of military resources. So what Israel is saying is this is a preemptive strike to make sure these assets don't fall into the wrong hands, into what they are describing as jihadis and what other people are describing as, the new government in Syria. We've heard some quite strong criticism from the UN. A UN special rapporteur said there is no right in international law to preemptively disarm a foreign state's military absent an armed attack from that country. And we have not seen any armed attack from the new government in Syria against Israel.
And the HTS, of course, is saying that it really isn't going to attack Israel.
Sure, we're hearing again. Compared to the rhetoric we heard from Hezbollah, which was very kind of fiery, always talked about a strong response. I think the actual statements we're hearing from the rebel government or interim government in Damascus is, one that I think will be viewed positively by a lot of governments. This rhetoric that they are not trying to enter into conflict, that they are not trying to. They say that while they have criticized Israel moving into the Golan Heights and seizing a security buffer zone, they say that Syria is conflict weary and it does not want to engage in more conflict. So it doesn't seem to be a priority for them.
Now, news has come in overnight of Israeli strikes in Gaza, which reportedly killed at least 53 Palestinians, including a journalist and rescue workers. What more do we know about this?
Sure. So we understand that Palestinian journalist Ahmed Alou and 5 Palestinian civil defense workers were killed in the Nusayrat camp in central Gaza. Again, this is just it's another media worker who has been killed in Gaza. Again, it's been the most deadly conflict on record for journalists and media workers. And again, it's also been extremely deadly for civil defense workers. And again, it's a reminder that, while attention might have kind of suddenly shifted to Syria, that, of course, the war in Gaza is continuing to go on. We are seeing, dozens killed every day. And again, the context is also in, winter now. And again, it's a very worrying humanitarian situation in Gaza, as it has been for over a year now.
Now, let's just have a look at the settlement expansion in the Golan Heights. Netanyahu's called it a necessary move. Why is that?
Well, for some, depending on, your position or your view, in Israel, the settlements are seen as a kind of preemptive, proactive security measure in order to create a kind of security buffer zone. Others will reject that idea that moving settlers into occupied land is something that improves security, and we'll see it as a destabilizing move. And indeed, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has said he did not see any reason for the country to expand into the Golan Heights. So it's worth noting that there are already Druze Arabs kind of living in this area. Parts of this area were not populated. It was a security buffer zone between Syria and Israel. So again, it's not clear what kind of conditions this land in is, but it's certainly a provocative move. And it certainly risks inflaming tensions between Syrian groups in that area and also with the Druze Arab population, who, last week we saw waving Syrian flags, in celebration at the toppling of the Assad regime.
So we know that the Arab League's issued a resolution condemning Israel's seizure of the territory. It's also reported that Arab nations have approached the UN Security Council to hold a session on Israel's actions in Syria. Do you think that's likely to happen, or if it does, to make any kind of difference?
Well, there's certainly been some public condemnation from Arab countries, the UAE in particular, condemned Israel's plan to double its population, the Golan Heights. It described it as an effort to increase escalation tensions in the region. But again, at the same time, what we're seeing, we're not seeing strong criticism of this move from the US. The US have actually, given their kind of tacit support to these preemptive Israeli strikes in Syria, saying it's necessary in a security vacuum to engage in this practice. They've described it as temporary, and I think the fact that that's the kind of language we're getting from the US, and the fact they have a veto on the UN Security Council means I don't think it's likely that we would get a strong condemnation from the UN Security Council currently.
I wonder if the attacks on Syria are a distraction tactic by Netanyahu to take focus away from what's happening in Gaza.
Again, we don't exactly know what his strategy is, but I mean, it's certainly a tactic he has used before, and I think creating chaos and creating kind of these events that distract again from what is an extremely costly ongoing war in Gaza, where there's been a huge loss of life for Palestinians, but where Israeli soldiers are also continuing to die regularly, and where the Israeli government is now having to plan, I think, $9 billion or about $9 billion or $10 billion worth of spending cuts next year to fund the war because of the huge expense involved in it.
Hannah, we speak to you often from the safety of our studio, and it really focuses the mind once more when we hear about journalists being killed. You're in the region, you're reporting on this on the ground every day. How are you and your colleagues holding up?
I mean, it's obviously very concerning to see, these strikes on colleagues, and we're also very aware that, particularly colleagues in Gaza are even more vulnerable than we would be. And I think it's very worrying that, this has become normalised. And of course, we think, there has to be a much stronger line and, this huge death toll that's being inflicted on journalists, and as well also the online targeting as well, the discrediting of journalists. Again, it's been a kind of very worrying year for that.
Hannah, thank you very much. Do keep safe. That's Hannah McCarthy there. And this is The Globalist. It is 8:11 in Berlin, 7:11 here in London. Today, the German Parliament will take a confidence vote on Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He's likely to lose, meaning another snap election within the next 2 months, further deepening the political crisis in Europe. Well, I'm joined now by Chris Chermak, Monocle Radio senior news editor. Chris, good morning to you. Many thanks for coming on the show. How did it get to this? And did Scholz have an alternative? Did he have to call this vote?
Well, he did basically have to call this vote, yes, because he does no longer have the support of enough members of parliament in order to keep governing. This, of course, all started when his governing coalition of 3 parties, the Social Democrats that he leads, the Greens and the Free Democrats, collapsed because he basically fired his finance minister, who's the head of the Free Democrats, Christian Lindner. So that's where this started. He said that the situation was untenable. He gave a very strong speech, which in a way was at the time perhaps quite surprising given that they had been working together for a number of years, but he really laid into Christian Lindner for sort of holding everything up in their coalition over the last few years and said, enough is enough. We have to go for new elections.
So who will Germans be deciding between when they vote in February? Who are the main contenders?
So the main contender really is one at this point, Georgina. It is looking like Friedrich Merz. He's the head of the Christian Democrats. That's the main center-right opposition party, formerly the party of Angela Merkel, of course. And Friedrich Merz is clearly in the lead. His party has well over 30% of the vote in polls at the moment. The Social Democrats of Olaf Scholz are not doing well by comparison. They're looking to come in somewhere in 3rd place. They're around 16% in the polls. The Alternative for Germany, the far-right party in German politics, looks like it might come 2nd, although we'll see how that goes. They're around 18%. And then you have other parties. The Greens are kind of close to the Social Democrats as well. So really the person that has been the most in the news, the most in the, kind of in the front of everybody's mind is Friedrich Merz. He is the one who is most likely, unless there is a major change between now and February, he's the one who's going to get a chance to finally become chancellor. He's wanted this for a very long time.
But I mean, there will almost certainly have to be a coalition. How might that plan out?
There will almost certainly have to be a coalition, yes. As I said, he'll get sort of a little over 30% of the vote. And that's always one of these big question marks in German politics because of the system they have. It can be tricky. He will have to, despite having, essentially rubbished the 3-party coalition that currently exists, he's going to have to work with one of those parties, depending on how the polling, how the actual election pans out. He might be able to say, form a coalition just with the Greens. That might be a kind of ideal solution for him, although there's actually never been a coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Greens before, or it would be what's known as a grand coalition with the Social Democrats themselves. The one thing that is clear, all of the parties have ruled out working with the Alternative for Germany, no matter where they come in this. And as I say, they're widely expected, at least according to current polls, to come in 2nd. No party has any interest in working with them in any kind of coalition.
So what are the main issues that will form the majority of the political campaigns? What is it that German citizens really care about?
It's a good question, Jodie. I mean, it depends who you ask, but I would say certainly the economy has to be front and center at this point. Germany's economy has been struggling. It's not doing very well at all. And in addition to that, you've seen in other countries, inflation is the topic. That's to some degree the topic in Germany as well, but it's particularly when it comes to electricity prices. This is something that Germany has struggled with under the current coalition government, in part because also with the Greens, there's been a number of measures to try and confront climate change. Very understandable, but at the same time, it is something that has raised energy prices, along with, of course, the war in Ukraine that has raised energy prices in Germany. And coupled with the fact that there is this sort of energy transition that was already started way back under Angela Merkel, the end of nuclear power. So all the parties are promising to try and bring energy costs back into line. That's one of the key promises they have. That's something that many parties want to work with. They just have different ways of doing it. And then a wide debate on investment, how to boost investment in Germany, kind of get companies back on track. A lot of them struggling at the moment. Many people, kind of describing Germany as once again the sick man of Europe. And then beyond that, of course, there is the topic of immigration, as there is in so many other European countries and other countries as well. This is an area where there is a dividing line. Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats has taken quite a strong stand, not as strong as the far-right Alternative for Germany, but he is calling for a stop, essentially, to immigration checks at the German border. He's also calling for basically Syrians, any Syrian that doesn't have a job, he would be expected to return to Syria at this point. That's one of his election platforms.
Now, Chris, in the 14 years after the First World War, Germany had 20 coalition governments, which eventually led to the Nazi Party taking power. Is the country on the same track now? Will we see a succession of failed coalitions and the rise of the AfD?
It's interesting when you put it compared to sort of World War I and that kind of area. I don't think that Germany is obviously in that kind of dire straits. I think some of the things that led to World War II was really, just how awful the economy was doing, in part because of sort of sanctions and other things put on it after the First World War. The German economy this time, it is not in a very strong position. That is true, but I'd almost liken that in some ways. You had this also back in the 1990s, early 2000s, before Gerhard Schröder became chancellor. This was a point where Germany was also known as the sick man of Europe. So they've had this sort of phase before. There is a lot of frustration out there. That's certainly true. But at the same time, I think even if you compare it to other European countries, it's fair to say that at least for the moment, there's still more of a ceiling when it comes to a party like the Alternative for Germany. They're polling around 18%. If you put that in European contexts of other countries, France and Eastern European countries and others, Austria for that matter as well, where the far right came in first in recent elections, it's not actually that high. So I think there's still an understanding of some of the lessons that Germany has had from its past, its Nazi past as well, that does put something more of a natural ceiling, I think, on the Alternative for Germany than in other European countries.
And speaking of other European countries, I mean, what does the fall of Germany's government mean for the EU? I mean, particularly after the events in France, the EU would appear to be facing a vacuum in leadership.
It is absolutely facing a vacuum in leadership. That comes from the failure of the government. But I think it's important to say that even without the failure of the government, Olaf Scholz was not a particularly strong chancellor in Germany and not a particularly strong leader in Europe. So there was that vacuum, if you will, even before the German government collapsed. So the question would kind of be, what kind of leader will Friedrich Merz be in that? Will he be able to be somebody who takes on more of that? You could make some argument that, he is a little bit more somebody of the times, given that he's kind of on the center right and takes a bit more of a hard line on some of these issues, whether it's immigration, but also at the same time, he's very pro defending Ukraine. He wants to send long-range missiles to Ukraine, the Taurus missiles that Olaf Scholz has refused to send. So he is quite a strong, strident voice And maybe that is something that Europe needs right now. I guess you could make an argument for that, certainly. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of leader he is and whether he tries to sort of reassert Germany's role on the European stage, even if, as I say, Germany's economy is struggling. And that's something that, it's always had its reputation as a European leader because of that economy. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
I mean, talking of Ukraine, if we look at take a broader view of this, Europe is dealing with Russia's aggression, also having to deal with the return of Donald Trump in the US. He's threatening a trade war on the bloc. He doesn't appear to be supportive of NATO. How will what happens in Germany influence global events?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, again, it does come down in the way to the leadership of the next German chancellor. The economy is one of these key issues when you talk about somebody like Donald Trump. Germany is going to face the brunt of that more than many others. This is a key reason why already a number of its industries are struggling and are particularly worried. Something like tariffs for an export-led economy like Germany's is only going to make things a lot worse. And then when it comes to, yes, NATO and Ukraine, as I say, that's where it'll be particularly interesting, I think, who emerges from this and whether Friedrich Merz, as expected, comes out on front, because he is somebody who is a more strident voice on this. He wants to defend Ukraine. He is pro-NATO. He is promising to build up Germany's military as well, invest in Germany's military, something that Olaf Scholz started after the war in Ukraine began, if you will. But Friedrich Merz certainly wants to finish that job. And Olaf Scholz, by comparison, is leaning a little bit more into the sort of peace initiatives, that it's time for peace in Ukraine. He doesn't want to send long-range missiles and so on and so forth. I think it's fair to say that he would be a somewhat weaker voice, although who knows, perhaps if he were to win this election and find some other kind of coalition, he would find his voice again going forward. But at the same time, just as a final note, it's maybe worth saying, compared to other countries, there's not that much of a difference between the candidates on foreign policy. They are both supporters of Ukraine, relatively strong supporters, even if there's some of this debate on the margins. So Germany's role in the world is not going to change that drastically in this election compared to, I don't know, if you look at France, as you're talking about, or other countries where there really is a huge potential change that could come to pass depending on which party wins.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Chermak there. Now, still to come on the programme. That's I Forget I'm So Young by the Austrian singer Sofie Royer. We'll hear a special interview with her later in the programme. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 7:23 here in London. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Georgina Godwin, and joining me in the studio now is the political journalist and broadcaster Theo Usherwood to have a look through the day's papers. Good morning to you, Theo.
A very good morning.
Now, in our headlines, we have been talking about these two Russian oil tankers which have been badly damaged in the Black Sea. More details emerging. What do we know now?
So this happened in the Kerch Strait, which of course is a piece of water that separates Russia from Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia back in 2014. The oil tankers are believed to have drifted before running aground offshore. They were each carrying around 4,300 deadweight tons of oil. Just to put it in perspective, the largest tankers carry about 120,000 tons. So they are relatively small. Nevertheless, a significant rescue operation had to be launched, rescuing 13 crew members from one of the oil tankers. Extraordinary footage released by the Russian Transport Authority, actually, of the bow of what that tanker going under the waves in the Kerch Strait. One crew member killed, whilst the 14 other crew members on the second tanker are actually having to wait it out while conditions improve so that they can be rescued. Of course, there had been some speculation that these tankers may have been what are known as ghost ships, effectively, which are used by the Russians to get around sanctions. But actually, these particular ships weren't ghost tankers. They were there. They were registered to a reputable company, and obviously there's a huge clean-up operation needed in the Black Sea as a result of the spill. But it isn't as disastrous as perhaps many had first thought it could be.
And it's not thought to be war-related?
No, not thought to be war-related or anything to do with the conflict in Ukraine. With of course that should be drawing to a conclusion in the new year, with President-elect Trump saying that actually he wants to broker some sort of deal between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. So this isn't an uptick in any way, shape or form of the conflict there.
Well, now, car makers certainly had an uptick during the pandemic, but now many are struggling. Tell us more about this story.
Yes, this is from the New York Times. And of course, during the pandemic, there was a shortage of semiconductors and other components, which actually allowed the car makers to put up their prices because there was effectively a shortage. And they put up the prices and they're doing quite well. But the accusation seems to be that the major car makers have been a little bit complacent and not taken advantage and not developed particularly electric vehicles and new technology as quickly as they might otherwise have done. Last month, of course, Ford announced 4,000 job losses in Britain and Germany. Nissan is looking to cut jobs in Mississippi and Tennessee, although they haven't said how many and exactly where they will fall. GM Motors as saying that they're looking at a $5 billion hit as it looks to profits, as they look to restructure their operations in China. And the main problem is China and cheap cars coming in, cheap new technology coming in from China. BYD, Chery, SAIC, SAIC, I think is an acronym. And they are taking the lead in Brazil, countries like Brazil, this is according to the New York Times, Australia, Chile, and Thailand. And what's interesting about this story is obviously Donald Trump is going to coming in and he's saying we're going to impose tariffs on Chinese imports. But actually it's not those tariffs from the what this article is saying actually are not necessarily going to make a huge amount of difference, because it's about Chinese companies being able to get into emerging markets and sell their vehicles, which would otherwise have been done by American companies. BYD, by the way, has developed a SUV, EV, electric vehicle SUV that can float in water for up to 30 minutes, apparently, and roll its wheels so that you can rotate the car. So the Chinese not only seem to be producing cheaper cars, but they seem to be producing new technology that they will hope will appeal to consumers around the world.
That certainly appeals to me.
Your car can turn into a little boat.
Fabulous. Let's talk about the UK government. Now, they have established contact with Syrian rebels, and this is very interesting because, of course, nobody knows which way HTS is going to go, but the British government's clearly going to give them a chance.
They are, yes, and that's a very good way of putting it, is that actually, HTS has had links to Al-Qaeda, has links to Al-Qaeda. It's promoted some violent jihadist rhetoric in the past. It's actually a proscribed terrorist organisation in the UK. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, not saying whether that is going to be reviewed. There has been some speculation, actually some noises from the Home Office that they're going to look again at this. But actually, David Lammy is saying that now they've established, it's very important to establish contact with HTS and to make sure that actually risks can be mitigated, because in Syria this was an unexpected takeover Assad was pushed out at incredible speed, not predicted by anybody. There is concerns that the Kurds in the east of the country are holding ISIS fighters who could be released and of course then could go on to commit atrocities around the world. President-elect Trump has said that he doesn't want America to get drawn into a conflict. At the same time, I know you've been discussing this, you've got stockpiles of chemical weapons, and the Israeli government is working at speed to try and neutralise those. But what David Lammy is looking to do is to establish contact with HTS they want to, and he said the British government wants to judge HTS on its actions rather than its previous rhetoric, to see whether actually work can be done between the British government. And we know the Home Office and the Foreign Office have been working very closely with agreements with Iraq and Germany when it comes to migratory flows, dealing with migratory flows as well, to make sure that Syria doesn't become a hotbed for terrorism that can be exported around the world and with atrocities committed around the world, or places like Britain, but at the same time to ensure that there isn't going to be a pressure of migrants if you have extreme amounts of violence, people being forced out of their homes, and then potentially north into Turkey and then across Europe to the UK. And I think that's something the British government is very wary about, trying to deal with at source in Syria, to establish and make sure there's an established government that is looking to represent everybody and all the different minority groups in the country.
And of course they've suspended asylum applications for Syrians who are already here.
Yes, but I think if you look at the small boats crisis in the English Channel, then whether the applications may be suspended, but those migrants who cross the English Channel will have safe refuge in this country, albeit that their applications have been suspended. And I think what the government doesn't want to happen is we've seen, countries suddenly spring up with, migrants coming from particular countries, whether it be Vietnam or Kurdistan. And I think they're very wary that Syria could become the next, if you like, source of the migratory flows as people are forced to flee their homes.
Finally, let's have a quick look at some French crockery.
Yes. Well, whenever you leave a restaurant, you often you leave. I know I've been to a restaurant, and you go to a restaurant, we sit down with my wife and go, we love those plates, we love those silverware. Where would they get those? But there's now a burgeoning trade in second-hand French crockery that's being sold, and it all started, I understand, with a black truffle soup which came about in 1975, which was served in very beautiful white bowls, which now this was by Paul Bocuse in Lyon, and you can now buy them for 80 euros each at the restaurant's gift shop in Lyon. And there's now a business that's been set up called Chef's Dishes, which sells crockery and cutlery in extraordinary numbers, secondhand from the France's top restaurants. They have a market in Lyon and in the city's Baroque market hall, and they sold 12,000 items within an 8-hour day to 8,000 customers. People turn up from across the country, and this is a story in the Times which I thought might interest you. And people turn up to buy the crockery and take it home. And many apparently, according to Chef's Dishes, the boss there, many people who turn up are left disappointed because they can't get exactly what they want. But there's a roaring trade.
I'm really very happy to hear that. But I get some of my crockery from there's a shop in Bogota which supplies my favourite restaurant in Cartagena, and so when I go to Bogota I stock up there. But to hear that you can do the similar thing in Lyon, much closer to home, very happy about that. Theo, thank you very much indeed. That's Theo Usherwood. Now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Several hundred people and possibly even thousands may have been killed when the most powerful cyclone in nearly a century hit the French Indian Ocean archipelago of Mayotte, a senior local French official said on Sunday. Cyclone Chido hit Mayotte overnight with winds of more than 200 kilometres per hour, damaging housing, government buildings and a hospital. A Russian oil tanker carrying thousands of tons of oil products split apart during a heavy storm on Sunday, while another tanker was also in distress after sustaining damage. The vessels were in the Kerch Strait between mainland Russia and Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. And the broadcaster ABC News has agreed to pay $15 million to US President-elect Donald Trump over a defamation lawsuit after its star anchor falsely said he'd been found liable for rape. George Stephanopoulos made the statements repeatedly during an interview earlier this year while challenging a congresswoman about her support for Trump. A jury in a civil case last year found Trump was liable for sexual abuse, which has a specific definition under New York law. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. On Saturday, the opposition-controlled South Korean parliament voted to impeach President Yoon Suk-yeol over his attempt to impose martial law. Yoon rejected the charges. He's vowed to fight to the end. The Constitutional Court will meet to discuss the case today, and although it has up to 180 days to rule, it's likely the result will come sooner. Meanwhile, Yoon has been suspended from duties and constitutional authority has been passed on an interim basis to Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. Well, I'm joined now from Seoul by John Lee, who's editor of Korea Pro. John, many thanks for joining us on the show. This was the second vote. The first failed. What changed and who flipped in the interim?
The first vote failed because the ruling People Power Party boycotted the vote, and only 5 of its lawmakers participated in the vote, preventing quorum from being achieved. And so the vote failed. But this time around, when it took place on Saturday, the People Power Party decided to take part, and the votes were all anonymous. And among the votes that were cast, about 12 ruling People Power Party lawmakers voted to impeach the president, which took the votes up to 204, which passed the minimum threshold for 200 votes.
And how's the news been received in the country?
Well, publicly, the public has been quite pleased about this result. According to a poll that was taken 2 days before Yoon was impeached, about 75% of the public wanted the president to either be impeached or wanted him to resign early. And so this was really embraced by much of the public. But as you pointed out, this is far from over. Now we have to look forward to the legal case, the legal battle that we are about to see.
Well, tell us more about that. What's the makeup of the Constitutional Court and what is the process now?
Well, right now there are 3 vacancies on the bench. There are supposed to be 9 justices, but there are only 6 at the moment. And the Constitution says that there needs to be a 2/3 majority of the justices to agree to impeach him. And so the reason why there are these 3 vacancies is that the opposition and the ruling parties just could not agree as to which candidates to nominate. But now that Yoon's impeachment has been passed in the National Assembly is going to move very quickly to fill those vacancies. Now, you pointed out that this might end sooner than we think, and we're not quite sure if that will actually be the case. The Yoon administration the President Yoon is going to try very hard to make this last as long as possible. And the reason for that is that when it comes in the coming next year, in April, there are going to be 2 justices of the Constitutional Court whose 6-year terms will come to an end. Now, at this point, it gets very dicey. The law states that after the justices serve 1 6-year term, they can have their term renewed so that they can serve a total of 12 years. But right now, the person who is going to have to appoint those 2 justices is the acting president, Han Duck-soo. He has the constitutional right to do so, but he doesn't have the political authority, the political capital to do so. And so Yoon is going to try to extend this for as long as he can.
But Yoon himself has no power at the moment. He's been suspended, right?
He has been suspended of his authorities, not his title. And so his legal defense is going to be that he declared martial law not to usurp the constitutional order, but rather to defend it, and that his actions were a part of that. Now, the court will have to determine whether or not his argument holds any legal weight. So that's the real crux of the matter right now.
And I mean, he's still at liberty, but some around him aren't. What arrests have been made, and is anyone else likely to face justice?
So far, the biggest arrest that was made was the defense minister, Kim Yong-hyun. He was part of that cabinet meeting, and he was the one who at least for now, supposedly suggested that the president declare martial law. There have been others who have been indicted, and those who will be called into investigations. Those include several military officers from the different branches and the different offices that were in charge of capital defense, for example. And there are also the interior minister, who was also part of that cabinet meeting. And there will be a lot more questions and investigations and arrests that will be coming.
Now, we are also hearing that Han Dong-hoon, the party leader, is stepping down. How consequential is that?
Han Dong-hoon was the party leader until just 2 hours ago. But he really did not hold much sway in his party. Now, he did flip-flop several times throughout this entire process, but in the end, he did say that he supported impeachments, that he wanted the lawmakers in the ruling party to also vote for impeachment. But among those lawmakers, as I said earlier, only 12 people sided with him. 85 ruling party lawmakers still voted against impeachment. So although he was party leader, he never really spoke for the party faithful, especially those who are loyal to the president. And so his departure really doesn't impact the party because he was so unpopular within the party and so unpopular with much of the public.
John, thank you very much indeed. That's John Lee there. You're with Monocle Radio. Now, it is 8:40 in Belgrade, 7:40 here in London, and there's no sign of an end to the protests in Serbia, which started after last month's disaster at the railway station in the country's second city, Novi Sad. Opposition parties, students, lawyers and even farmers have been staging silent vigils, blockades and demonstrations. That's despite President Alexander Vučić saying he'd meet their demands. Well, Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delaunay, can tell us more. Guy, good morning to you and thanks for coming on the show. Can you remind us of the trigger for these protests?
Well, as you alluded there, Georgina, there was a collapse of a concrete canopy at Novi Sad railway station on the 1st of November, and 15 people died when that structure fell on top of them. And this was particularly shocking because a renovation at that station, which had taken years, in fact, the station had been reopened twice officially, had two inauguration ceremonies. That reconstruction had only been completed in July. And this facility was part of one of the government's flagship infrastructure projects, which is the high-speed railway line from Belgrade to Budapest. So as well as shock and grief over the disaster and the deaths, there was immediate anger because people were saying, well, look, this is a high-profile government-sponsored project. Lots of money's gone into it. We've had this catastrophic collapse of the canopy. And people, of course, are suspecting the corruption is behind the whole thing.
And what's been the official response?
Well, we've had 2 ministerial resignations so far and more than a dozen arrests. Prosecutors still investigating. They're looking at who might have been to blame, what might have been the causes of the accident. But none of this has satisfied the increasing both number and variety of protesters. And we've seen these protests, Georgina, spread from Novi Sad itself, where, of course, the initial demonstrations, silent candlelit vigils initially in Novi Sad took place. But these demonstrations have spread to the capital, Belgrade, and other cities around the country as well, particularly involving students, but not just limited to them.
Now, the president says he will meet all the protesters' demands, but has he?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Now, Mr. Vučić said that he would make sure that any students who'd been arrested in these protests would be released without charge. And he also said the authorities would publish all the material relating to the railway station and the investigation into the collapse of the canopy. And a lot of this information is now indeed available on the government's website. But the protesters aren't satisfied. They say that not everything is available in terms of the documentation. And in any case, what are they meant to do with all of this? All along, they've also been calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Miloš Vučević, who, apart from being current head of government, was formerly the mayor of Novi Sad. They also want criminal charges against people who've attacked the protests. There's a great suspicion among the protesters and opposition parties that agents provocateurs, possibly sponsored by the authorities, have been going in to stir up trouble at various demonstrations, in some cases attacking public buildings, in other cases just attacking protesters.
Now, protests aren't uncommon in Serbia. Is there a sense that these demonstrations are a particular problem for Vučić?
Well, this is the thing with Mr. Vučić. He's been in government now one way or another, either as president, prime minister or deputy prime minister, but he was really running the show for 12 years. And he remains, despite the problems which many people will cite with his government, the authoritarian tendencies, domination of the media and of the public sector, he remains very popular with the electorate. And lots of protests and numerous issues that have come up in Serbia in these past 12 years haven't dented Mr. Vučic's standing in the country. The problem here is that he has specifically used the railway project time and again as proof that what he and his Progressive Party are doing is working for Serbia, that these infrastructure projects are modernising the country, that they're taking Serbia forward. And if this one can't be trusted, if you've got a recently renovated railway station that collapses, and this is something that he was very personally associated with, well, what else is there in this country that might also be dangerous for its citizens? That's what people are asking now. And of course, if corruption is behind everything, who's been enriching themselves while putting the citizens' lives in danger?
Guy, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That was Guy Delaunay. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Well, it's time for some business news now with Isabel Hamilton, who's a senior reporter at the Daily Upside. Good morning to you, Isabel.
Good morning.
Let's talk about electric car manufacturers and some tax charges.
So, this is a report in the Financial Times about Elon Musk's pay packet at Tesla. Now, a few years ago, this pay package was agreed that would grant Elon Musk 304 million shares if he hit certain milestones. Those milestones were hit last year, but a judge ruled that actually the pay packet was inadmissible because she basically thought that Elon Musk himself had too much sway over the board and that therefore you couldn't really view this pay grant as something that was independently arrived at by the board. What the FT is reporting is that they're going to still try and appeal this, rejection, because that judge has now rejected the pay package twice. But if they do accept that ruling and say, OK, we'll reissue a new pay package for him, they could get hit with really big tax bills. And so they're going back to court, even though if they lose that battle there, they're on the hook for about $100 billion in, various charges.
Well, I mean, he may have a huge sway over his board. It would appear he also has a huge sway over the incoming president of America, Donald Trump, of course. Our next story is about Trump and his tariff threats.
Yes. So this was a Wall Street Journal report that CEOs have been trying to lobby the president-elect. This is quite normal when there's a president coming in and they've put forward some policies. Obviously business leaders will try and get some face time. They'll try and influence things. But apparently it's really not working. And they're being told by Trump's advisors to just not bother lobbying on the tariffs because Trump just isn't budging.
And I mean, in terms of what this means for Europe, what is your prediction here?
Well, I think that for us in the UK, the last I read was that we're going to be pretty insulated, but it really depends on sort of how the diplomacy of it shakes out. Primarily, we're looking at big impact on places like Canada and Mexico and China that are huge trading partners for the US. But, this is going to have plenty of domino effect, and it's going to just stoke geopolitical tensions. So it's going to make life really tricky.
Now, to Christmas dinner. It's going to cost less this year. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, so this was a BBC report. It looks like, various elements of the Christmas meal this year have gone down in price, like turkey, sprouts, gravy granules. So overall, it's going to cost less. But there is a bit of a caveat on that. There are some items that have really spiked in price, and those are particularly root vegetables. Potatoes are up 26%, which is enormous, and carrots are up 13%. This is partly because we had a really awful year for harvesting root vegetables. So, yeah, the price has gone up.
So just tell us what sort of prices we're looking at here, because I find that these costs here very interesting.
Let me see.
A family Christmas set to cost $31.66 this year. That's down from $32.18 the year before. That seems to me quite a small amount.
Yeah, the BBC analysis was across lots of different supermarkets. They found that Aldi was the cheapest. That was, I think, £24.30. So, even cheaper than the average. And then up at the top, we've got Tesco with £36.51. So, it's nice. The prices come down. But again, there are some caveats. Things like, I think desserts weren't included in that analysis, and they in general have gone up, like Christmas puddings, mince pies. And that's to do with lots of different factors, like, for example, the cost of electricity.
And Isabel, what are you going to be having for Christmas dinner?
I think I'm going to be having a 3-in-1, which is like a turkey, but with a duck and some other kind of bird stuffed inside it.
Like a pigeon or something? No, what's the one in the middle? I can't. And it's got a. It's got a portmanteau name as well. The whole thing
is guinea fowl.
A guinea fowl. And what's the word we used to describe that? There's a sort of. It's called like a.
There's an American word which is a turducken.
A turducken.
Yes.
Right, well, I hope your turducken is absolutely delicious. Isabel Hamilton, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, those familiar with the Monocle Radio playlist will have heard of Austrian singer Sofie Royer. She's just released a new album. It's called Young Girl Forever. It's an electro-pop record exploring the contradictions of being a female artist today. Monocle Radio's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco caught up with Sofie here at Midori House.
Sofie Royer, first of all, welcome to Monocle Radio. A pleasure to have you here. I love your music.
Thank you.
I don't know if you've seen, but we did a special on Austrian pop, and I've added you as well on the list. But of course, your parents are from both Austria and Iran, but you grew up in California. I actually didn't know that before reading up more about you.
Yeah, my mother's Austrian, my father's Iranian, and they were both engineers, and that's why I was born in Palo Alto, California, because they were working for Apple at the time. Yeah, it's fun.
And, well, let's talk about your new album, which I think is fantastic. So it was inspired by a book called Preliminary Materials for the Theory of a Young Girl. Mm-hmm. So tell us what made you connect to that piece of work, so much so that you even titled your album with it.
So I had finished the record earlier this year, between the period of, I want to say, January and March, before we got to the mixing of the record. Parallel to that, I was on tour as the opening act for my friend Louis Hoffman. So we were touring France and Spain, a little bit of Germany. And I had been recommended the book for the Xth time. And so I decided to read it. I decided to finally give it a read. There's another really great zine by Tikkun, the collective, called Instruction Manual for a Civil War. I'd read that. I loved it. I thought it was very funny. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to give this text a try. And it, I think, was especially refreshing for me to read, just having kind of come off being in the last semester of my own studies in philosophy and psychology and English. So I was forced to kind of read a lot of theory. I didn't have too much time to spend reading belletristic or generally kind of more left field books. I do love verso books and their sale, and there's like a staple of like, I don't know, a few books that I'd been meaning to read and never got around to. And so when it came to me being on tour, I kind of had the book on my phone. I had like a PDF of the book on my phone. And the way it's written, I don't know if any of the listeners have seen it, but there's almost kind of these very quick phrases written in different fonts as kind of these pop statements on, let's say, the young girl is a commodity or the young girl is a good in consumer society. And I thought that was very interesting and very funny. And yeah, obviously ended up finding parallels to our own reality, my own existence, as well as just generally the society and structure that we live in. It's the same if you read like an Irving Joffman or a Pierre Bourdieu. You're like, oh, this is so universally applicable and still very relevant for today's day and age.
And I was very curious about the album, so the idea of the young girl as well. Is there something about living permanently in this state of youth as well?
Well, so the interesting thing about the young girl, it's not, if you read the book, it's not so much actually about like a female girl, and it's not so much about her necessarily being young. It's kind of just like this is a placeholder figure. And I do get asked a lot in interviews kind of to like relate it back to something very temporal, but I don't necessarily think that's what the book stands for or is supposed to stand for. But that's also my interpretation of it.
Oh, of course. Let's talk about some of the music as well. As I said, I'm a big fan. We play some of the songs here on Monocle Radio. For example, one of my favorites, and it is a single as well, I Forget I'm So Young. It's so beautiful, and of course, not even the lyrics, the beats, there's something quite nostalgic about it as well. What do you have to say about the song? I wonder what was the process for that song in particular?
Well, this song was kind of a song in between other songs on the record. I had my bassist in the studio that day, Marcus Windisch, who, I don't know if anybody's listening, but he's amazingly talented. He was playing this little riff, and I was like, oh, that needs to be its own song. And that's kind of how that song happened. I think I wrote to it in like 5 to 10 minutes. It's really like one of those songs that's like, that happened very fast. And we maybe spent the most time on it, my sound engineer and I, on like making that drop with the church bells. That was maybe the most stressful thing. But like the keys I played super fast, the bass line was recorded super quickly, the little guitar licks very fast. So there's really not a lot of overthinking going on with that song, which is maybe what makes it so catchy.
It is very catchy. And it's funny, and the whole album, I would say, has a very kind of danceable mood to it. Would you agree more, perhaps, than your first 2 albums, which I'm not saying they were not danceable.
No, you're totally right.
This is party album in a way.
It's totally right. I got tired of playing songs on stage that were morbid, and I wanted to do something a little more dauntless and lighthearted, and for me to have more fun when I'm playing live.
That was Sofie Royer there in conversation with Fernando Augusta Pacheco. Her album Young Girl Forever is out now. And of course, when you listen to our playlist, she does crop up very often. In fact, I think she was the very last track this morning before we came to the Globalist. And we'll be listening to her again in the hours that come. And that's all for today's programme. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. And the briefing is live at midday in London. I'll be here for that. Many thanks to our producers, Anita Riotta, Carlotta Rebello, Laura Kramer, our researcher, Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager, Lily Austin. And that's it. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.